Good afternoon. The title of this short presentation is U.S. Meat Demand, Effects of Increasing Media Attention to Animal Well-Being Issues. As most of us are well aware, U.S. consumers are expressing increasing interest in how their food is produced. In particular, they want more information on what production practices are being used on the farm and throughout the supply chain that ultimately influence and generate the food they're consuming. Example concerns are the use of growth hormones in beef production, the use of GM corn in livestock production, the use of antibiotics in pork production, are just some of multiple examples I could give you on different production practices and attributes that carry along with meat, milk, and egg products that are of increasing concern to U.S. consumers. Within this broad context of desire for more information on how our food is produced, one particular issue that's raising up on the radar, both on consumer and livestock producers in terms of their decision making, is animal welfare, or more broadly, how we care and handle farm animals that are ultimately being produced to generate food, milk, and eggs for human consumption. One example to kind of demonstrate this is 7 states in the Union now have effectively banned the use of gestation crates or stalls, either currently or for some time in the near future. Gestation crates and stalls are a controversial production practice. It's commonly used in the U.S. swine industry, and I'm not going to give specific details on that practice, but it's an example of one production practice that some consumers and residents are expressing concern with, and it's in the broader context of a desire to know more about how our food is being produced, and that ultimately is shaping things that are going on in the U.S. livestock industry. Perhaps not surprisingly, economists are faced trying to answer lots of questions in this rapidly developing situation as U.S. livestock producers try to respond to societal concerns on this broad animal welfare front. There's lots of different questions to assess. The narrow question and purpose of this short presentation is to highlight the findings of a study focusing on one of those questions, and that is, how has aggregate meat demand, that's beef, pork, poultry demand, been impacted by animal welfare concerns? So real quickly, what we did, and we would be my collaborators, Nicole Olink, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Ag Econ at Purdue University. We did a massive search going back all the way to 1980 to gather all the articles that were mentioned in U.S. newspaper and magazines, major U.S. newspaper magazines, using the keywords here on the screen. And the purpose of this is we're trying to build an information index that in some context proxies the information the average U.S. consumer is getting on this issue over time. And we want to assess what impact that's had on beef, pork, and poultry demand. Here's a picture of what those indices look like. We did this separately for the beef industry, the pork industry, and poultry industry. That's why there's 3 different indices here. I'm happy to discuss details of this, but all I want to note here is the information that the consuming public is getting as it relates to animal welfare concerns in a broad context has been increasing rapidly, as you can see. These lines are increasing as you move left to right from 1980 to 2008. What we did was we took that information and we plugged it into something, a large economic meat demand model. So it's a comprehensive economic analysis. I'm not going to give you all the details of that study. I'm going to focus on the animal welfare conclusions of that study. And what you have on the screen are what we call compensated elasticities. And what these are is the percentage change in beef, pork, poultry, or other food, which would be non-meat food demand, that result from a 1% change in one of these animal welfare indices. So the first thing I want to note is these elasticities I'm showing here on the screen are notably smaller than price and expenditure elasticities. Stated differently, a 100% change in price or a 100% change in expenditures has a notably larger impact on demand for these products than equivalent 100% changes in animal welfare information. That's as expected and consistent with similar exercises looking at food safety impacts. A couple example interpretations here. Both pork and poultry demand are found to be reduced in the long term as there's additional animal welfare information reaching them through the media. In particular, from 1999 to 2008, there was a 180% and a 253% increase in the indices that we measured here for the pork and poultry industries. That means there's more than double the information in 2008 that there was in 1999 that's reaching the average U.S. consumer simply through the media, much less other outlets. Our model suggests those increases are associated with a 2.7 and a 5% demand reduction for pork and poultry, respectively. Stated differently, if there was no change in the information that consumers were receiving as it relates to animal welfare in these respective industries between 1999 and 2008, the demand we'd observe for pork and poultry products in the U.S. would be 2.7 and 5% higher. So while these impacts are notably smaller than price and expenditure impacts, we can hardly consider those non-consequential. It's also worth noting that we estimated this model multiple different ways and tested whether there were cross-species spillover effects. And what I mean by that was we tested if an article that's focusing on the pork industry has an impact on beef demand or has an impact on poultry demand. And in short, we basically conclude those impacts are zero, which is just something to note that there's not these what we call cross-species spillover effects when it comes to animal welfare, but those have been found, for instance, in context of food safety before. So animal welfare responses are a little bit different than food safety responses. Now, it is important to note that while the beef industry does not have a direct statistical strong finding of demand consequences for more animal welfare information, they are impacted by one large trend from this model. And in particular, the meat expenditures are largely reallocated away from the three meats in favor of the non-meat food category when we have additional information coming into the pork or poultry arena. So as our indices focusing on animal welfare aspects of the pork industry or the poultry industry increase, there's a reallocation of that total meat expenditure to the non-meat sector. And in that context, all three of these meat species stand to lose as more information reaches the U.S. consumer. What are the implications for this? Well, first, the livestock industry in general needs to recognize these demand impacts do exist. Moreover, they may not cover the average adjustment costs that are needed to mitigate these impacts. That certainly needs additional research, but this is an additional point on a building argument that myself and others have been noting in our research for a couple of years now, that there appears to be a dilemma between resident voting drivers of change, for instance, propositions, ballot initiatives, and what is exercise consumption decisions. All right, there's a dilemma on a difference here. What this study here is looking at is the actual consumption decisions and how they change as we have more information related to animal welfare come into the market. And we're observing that those impacts do not match, let's say, the signals that residents are sending when they go vote at the ballot box. That dilemma certainly needs more research and support for the livestock industry to note. Moreover, this budget reallocation effect point that I noted before calls for a broader multi-species collaborative response or strategic development on behalf of the entire meat industry. Thank you for your time.